Very briefly, just a quick introduction to our work, and just to show you where it leads into fundraising and so on. Just very briefly about 2 and 3. Our mission is to build the capacity of organizations to have a transformative social impact. Like we have a very clear vision, I suppose, on moving the world, enabling the world towards a social economy and meeting the needs of its people. And sports has a very, very important role in all that. And it's something our CEO, Dennis O'Connor, myself, and a number of others are incredibly interested in sport. And I suppose, it's transformative potential on society and on community. Our team itself, we've a large team. We're the largest fundraising, or the largest non-profit consultancy in Ireland, across a range of practices. And, so we've specialisms, myself in fundraising, but all the way from recruitment, strategy, grants, which will be applicable for the tail end of our discussion, corporate partnerships, etc. And just in terms of our geographic imprint, we have offices Cork, Dublin, Galway, and Belfast, but we've worked with clients now right through the country, indeed over the whole island. And just in terms of sports, like I say, we've particular interest in sports from CEO level down. But we've worked with a wide range of sports. These are just some of the selected clients that we've worked with. Me, myself, and I've explained to MOI before this call, you have to be just careful in terms of my terminology, but I have worked with Munster Rugby as interim head of the patrons program there. But we work with a wide range of sports clients, and particularly with grants on that side of it as well. We have particular experience working with sports clubs and a high success rate in achieving grant funding for sports clubs. So how I'd like to begin is just to give a little bit of context for you. And sport holds, I suppose, an interesting place in terms of where it feels it is on the fundraising landscape in Ireland. But I just want to give a little bit of context to what's happening in Ireland in terms of fundraising and sport. And just to ask that first question, how do sports organizations engage in philanthropy? And it's more than just fundraising. We also look at in terms of volunteering, sponsorship, and fundraising. So on that volunteering level, at least half of Ireland's 1 million+ volunteers give time to sporting activities. So it's an incredible statistic, and it's worth thinking about that. Half of Ireland's 1 million volunteers give time to sporting activities. And in discussion, we might go into a little bit of a discussion around that, in that, does that impact actually on people's willingness to give in other ways if they feel they're already given their time? So, it's a very interesting question. According to the Federation of Irish Sport, there's something like 37.3 million hours of volunteering for Ireland's registered sport organisations, valued at something like 1.5 billion to the Exchequer. So it's an incredible aspect, I support, of sports in Ireland. Me, myself, I, way back when, did an MSc, a master's thesis on the role of philanthropy in strategic sports sponsorship in Ireland. And that question still persists, how much of sponsorship that's received by sporting organizations, how much of it, in effect, is actually a form of corporate philanthropy? And I would reckon a considerable amount of it. And we do posit that question. It's different from charitable giving, but is it still philanthropic in nature? And then finally, fundraising in a pure sense. And we break that down. We look at that in more detail in terms of individual giving, local community event type fundraising, and then also in terms of selling, things like you'd be very familiar with your raffles and your merchandise. So we'll look at all those in their own space. So I mentioned that some 50% of all volunteering in the Irish nonprofit sector is in sporting organisations, and that compares with about 70% of income share for sport. So you can see there's a massive discrepancy there. So the sports or recreation only receives 7% of philanthropic income or fundraising income, but receives 50% of all volunteering. So it further emphasises the strength of volunteering in the sports space. Now, where does sport fit into the philanthropic pie? So in terms of all non-profits in 2021, this is data from Giving Ireland 2023, the latest data that we have, something like 18 billion in fundraised income in 2021, which is up 5% from the previous year, of which fundraising income then of 1.63 billion. That's down 9%. So sport, the piece of the pie, if you like, is a total income of 892 million and a total fundraised income of 120 million, down some 0.2%. So the sports share of the philanthropic pie is 7%, and it outperformed the market in 2020-21. Okay, and then moving on from that, looking at the funding model, if you like, in terms of where does money come from. So on the left, we'll look at the wider sector. Some 63% in the wider non-profit sector. 63% of the income came from public sources, 21% from earned income sources, 10% fundraise. So we always use that as a good rule of thumb for funding models for organizations in the charity space. Some 10% is typically fundraised. And then, the remaining 6% from other sources. Compared then with the sports sector, quite a similar picture. But, one obvious change there is some 14% is typically fundraised. So 10% in general, 14% in the sports space. In terms of then the size of donations that organizations on the left, you see what's typical in the sector, and then on the right then being what's typical in the recreation and sports sector. 37% of sporting organizations typically don't fundraise at all, with some further the next 48% fundraising less than 250k. So the picture it's building there is in the recreation sports space is a lot of organizations raising relatively small amounts of money. The next slide then, just to bring this into the conversation as well, I'm not going to dwell on it too much, but not all methods of fundraising are created equally. And we have various bits of data on this, but the cost to raise €1 typically in Ireland is in around 25 to 30 cents. It costs money to raise money. And we can empirically show that. And what we show as well, looking at the different fundraising methods, we can talk about some of those later on, is the relationship type fundraising methods typically give the best return on investment. And it's very interesting to look at things like direct marketing appeals, can be very, very costly. Emergency appeals, the same. Community events, these kind of things can be quite costly, but they do have a benefit beyond the financial, just in terms of brand awareness and being able to shout about your organization and so on. It's just worth bearing that in mind for further discussion. So finally, just to leave this section in terms of where we are in terms of philanthropy and sports in Ireland, just I suppose us as an organization, where do we see everything going over the next 4 to 5 years? We see Ireland's philanthropic pie increasing. So potentially 3 billion within 5 years from 1.63 billion at the moment. So quite a large and rapid change in terms of total philanthropic income. We feel also that the share that sports owns within that would potentially increase as well within that 5-year period from currently 7% up to 11%. So on the whole, there's an increase not just in the size of the pie, but the proportion of the pie owned by sports. And what we see is within the next 5 years, a dramatic increase actually in philanthropic income earned by the sports sector in Ireland, up to 330 million from 120 million. So I suppose that's us throwing that out there as an extrapolation of what we feel could happen to philanthropy and sports. So our conversation today, very, very relevant for all sorts of reasons. So moving on from that, that's the end of the stats bit. What I want to talk about next is strategy. And I suppose the big message for me coming from a strategic fundraising background for sports is the importance of setting out a clear and logical strategy for fundraising. And I don't know what people's expectations, I suppose, was coming into today's meeting, but very often when people think about fundraising, they get very fixated on the method. How are we going to fundraise? What fundraising? Would it be a lotto? Would it be individual giving, selling, merchandising, whatever it might be? But for us, it's very much around laying out a strategy, laying out your stall in terms of how are you going to strategically approach fundraising as a club, as a cricket club in Ireland. So just in a nutshell, a very neat, this is like a back of an envelope type fundraising strategy that you can all follow. What is the process in a nutshell? So boil right down. So for me, it's something like a club vision. What's the vision for your club over the next 4 to 5 years? And what happens when that meets a spreadsheet? So what do we mean by that? Well, that's two rhetorical questions there. First is, well, how much do you need? So can you actually quantify how much money your club needs over the next 5 years in order to really realize the vision for the club? And then, of course, what will you spend it on? And there, for me, actually, are the two big questions of fundraising. In terms of the fundraising methods and so on, that comes a little bit further down the line. But it's a really good starting point for any club to ask yourself, what do we need? What will we spend it on? After that, then, it's about making a plan, and that's putting the process in place. What is our funding mix? How do we plan to get it? And it mightn't just be fundraising. You saw the funding models presented there for sports and for the wider nonprofit sector. It might be around grants would be a significant part of it. Earned income would be another substantial part of it. And then you look at funding, look at maybe borrowing, invested income, etc., etc. So it's all really about developing your funding model. And then within fundraising, then it's looking at the methods that are best for you. So we're going to look at some of those methods a little bit further down. The other question then, typically we would call it something like a case for support or a case statement. And really what it is asking you, why should someone give to you? And the message coming loud and clear from government circles, and I suppose in the wider movement, if you like, of the nonprofit space, is that it's more than just a sporting case for a sporting organization. If I was talking to, the housing sector, I'd be saying it's more than just housing per se. It's all about building a much wider impact case around, the economic benefits, the social and community impact, and then of course the sporting case for it. And then finally, in this abridged model then is we need to shout about it. How do you get the word out there? And it's not just to club members. When you're talking about social and community, it's the whole wider stakeholder network that could go all the way to government, and so on in terms of grants and public funding and so on. So how do you get the word out there to the wider field? So another way of presenting that, again, a very practical roadmap for you in terms of setting out a process is something like this, 6 questions that you can begin to answer. What's your vision and ambition? Do you have a 5-year plan? Now, it depends. Very often in sport, 4-year plans can make a lot of sense in terms of Olympic cycles and so on. Or 3-year, 4-year. Do you have a plan in place? Can you cost it? Then asking yourself, how will we raise this money? Then who, what individuals, what companies, what clusters of people or organizations will support our vision? And then how do we communicate our vision then to our wider stakeholder group? So that, and we can return to this then in the Q&A if we wish, but that is in essence then is a process for impact fundraising for support. Now I present a very linear model in terms of how fundraising happens and so on. So, I do like to remind people, I love to show this, that very often the road of fundraising looks very much like that. Like I'm currently fundraising now for 3 large infrastructural capital projects, including Basketball Ireland. And in terms of what's gone for Basketball Ireland over the last month, I'm sure you're all aware of the controversy with the match against the Israelis and so on. So it was a very, very difficult situation for all concerned, and it was really brought home to me in terms of how unlinear, or alinear maybe is the word, but how non-linear even the whole process is. So you need to bear that in mind. Set out your plan, and that's very much around keeping the road as least rocky as possible, but bear in mind it comes with the ups and downs along the way. Okay, so moving on from that strategy piece, just to look a little bit more closely at that impact piece for sport. And this is a message, we recently presented at the Federation of Irish Sports, and there was departmental secretaries presenting at that. Very, very interesting. even in relation to the impact now on climate change and so on sports. Just a very quick aside, it was very interesting for me. They were speaking of, say, for example, a large sporting event, 50,000 people landing on Dublin for a big rugby match, for example. What's the carbon cost of that? It's a very interesting question. So that's an absolute aside to this, but it is all coming down the road. But another message coming out of that day was this idea of sport matters. And this is coming loud and clear. So this will permeate through the grant system for sports, sports capital and LSSIF and so on. This idea of sport matters. So whatever messaging you're putting out there, it's so important to reflect, I suppose, the impact that you as a sports club are actually having on a wider community. Is sport being a key expression of community in both rural and urban spaces, this idea of the connection between sport and health, the idea of success in sport, helping Ireland's brand, inclusion, all elements around diversity and sports inclusion, and also that sports infrastructure, it needs significant investment to have that kind of impact. And that investment is not just infrastructure, but also in terms of human capital. And we saw that with the stats that we have on volunteering. So it's really important in your messaging that you really double down on that in terms of the impact of sports beyond just you as a sports club, but in terms of where you are in the community. So just on that, and I'm not going to dwell too much on this, but the really important to show that community impact, showcasing that the impact that you're having on both the game, the wider community, show tangible improvements, through the development of state-of-the-art facilities, show how that's helping in terms of community engagement, etc. Show impact in terms of local environment and local socioeconomics. And, and again, I'm just reiterating that by investing in sports infrastructure and programs, governments themselves then are harnessing transformative power of cricket and other sports to address social issues. So that's where the government messaging and the government thinking now is going in terms of supporting sports in general. So it's just really important to jump on the wave, I suppose, of that thinking at governmental level. Okay, and then just another thought then, just in terms of on the impact side, I was showing this to Emma earlier on. It was brought to mind to me, Matt McCarroll was former CEO of, I was thinking of it earlier on, Cycling Ireland, Triathlon and Hockey Ireland. And he's an associate consultant of 2 and 3s now. But just in discussion with him, we had, we were just in discussion on fundraising and sports and so on. Matt reminded me.
Sorry, Rob, just one sec. Perfect. Just a reminder, just make sure you're on mute just so that any background noise is blocked out.
Thanks, Emma. But this idea that in your back pocket, always know what your club needs. And that's the immediate necessity, I suppose, what you actually need in order to keep the lights on, so to speak. But also in your back pocket, know what the club wants to have. So there's a need to have, and then there's a want to have. And then what's more than just keeping the lights on, the immediate necessity, but what would actually really enhance your club's infrastructure and programs and so on. And then beyond that, again, also know what your club would love to have. Money was no object. What would you be doing with your club? And that's really, I suppose, looking at a type of forward thinking, having that in your back pocket. And when you're going out, starting to fundraise, and I suppose on a more substantial level, that you have, if all the stars align, that you know that what you could be fundraising for. And it's really, really good advice. And not only just in terms of fundraising, but also, I suppose, in setting out a big vision for the club as well, and what you can achieve over into the horizon of the club's future. So there's some little pieces, little asides related to impact and that whole side of it. So now, moving on from the strategy side of it, what I'd like to talk about next, I suppose, is more practically speaking, is what can you be doing on a fundraising level? And like I said to Emma earlier on, what I really want to emphasize today is is having a strategic approach to fundraising, lining up on all your ducks, really knowing what you want to do as a club. What's the vision? What do you really want to set out and achieve over a 5 and 10 year period and so on? And have all that and have it all costed and so on. But the next stage of it is, but on a very practical level, what can you do in order to fundraise? And what I'm not offering here is prescriptive. So I'm going to throw at you now over the next few slides is ideas. And then really you have to see, internally as a club, what really, really works for you at a club level in terms of what's practical to do, but also what do you like doing? What do you really as a club not want to do? So on, so on. So you have to make that decision yourself. And as I mentioned earlier, how do sports organizations engage in philanthropy? So, 3 broad categories, if you like. We at 2 into 3 are big fans of individual giving. We feel it's very much underdeveloped in terms of clubs, sports clubs fundraising in Ireland. In a way, I suppose that is more developed when you look at your typical charities and so on. And by individual giving, we mean that type of relationship-based fundraising, where you're asking individuals, you're building a strategy, a case for support, and then you're out asking individuals for support. It is, as I note there, the most strategic option, but it does require, I suppose, a little bit more nuance. You do need to build your case. And, very often in the Irish context, that most terrible of things that you do have to make individual asks of individuals. So, in terms of examples of that, and it can be simplified, for example, asking for 5 years membership up front load development could be an example of that. Or making a compelling case for a single large gift from an individual or company with a strong relationship or a lifelong connection to your club. That's what we mean by individual giving. And as I said, to reiterate that, we feel it's one area that's particularly underdeveloped in Ireland when you compare it with, say, the English market or with the US market. Following on from that then, events, you might be more familiar with that kind of community level fundraising. It does require more effort. It does rely more on volunteers, but as we discussed, volunteerism is so strong in the sport area that may not present as a problem. And also what advantage you would have over individual type giving. It's brilliant for building profile and getting you out into your community. And a wonderful opportunity in terms of player recruitment or in terms of coaching recruitment and so on. It does offer that in a way that individual giving doesn't. Finally, then, the selling aspect of it, and it's almost omnipresent in bigger clubs and GA circles and soccer circles to some extent, but it is becoming increasingly popular. Again, tickets have to be sold, so it requires a lot of effort and does rely on volunteers. And the question now for smaller clubs, is it scalable? And will you be lost in the noise with so much clubs out there now doing it? So it's quite a competitive space as well. I just mentioned organizations like iDonate and Club Force provide the infrastructure for that kind of work that you might be familiar with. Now, moving on from that, I mentioned Club Force. I've no invested interest in Club Force, but just borrowing from their work, and I want to reference that, just to throw at you like a top 10 of options in terms of how do you actually fundraise. And you can see them there from 1 to 10, your memberships, your lottery, sports capital grants, sponsorship, leasing the clubhouse and training pitches, your raffles and giveaways, summer camps, quiz nights, annual award nights, and then organizing sponsor challenges and sports days. So these might be some of the fundraising methods that you might consider then, to and include as part of your fundraising strategy. I've borrowed very much from the non-profit space. This is for the Crash Ensemble. And just to say that, this type of individual giving, one-to-one fundraising, very familiar to those in the non-profit space. And just to give you an example in a different subsector of how it would be set up. And they've created a committed giving or a regular giving structure. Here's 2 of the 4 categories. They set it up as giving X amount per month or a total amount per year. And that set up then is aligned then with a range of benefits then that you get then in ascending level as you give more to the organization. So this is how charities, arts, non-profit organizations set up their giving in a very formal way. So it could be something your club could consider in terms of setting up committed or regular giving beyond club membership. Moving on from that, I'm just now really just throwing ideas at you. It's an example from GEA. I used to live, I'm based in Cork, and I used to live on the Model Farm Road where Bishopstown GEA are. So the floodlights used to shine into our kitchen in the evening. So I know it very well. But it started out as from very humble backgrounds, farmers' fields in Bishopstown. But they've gone on a very concerted effort to develop. It's one of the wealthiest clubs in Cork now. But very interesting. I thought it was the model they have for fundraising. The Club Lotto, you'd be very familiar with. It barely is worth mentioning. But a members' bond scheme. So the club offered bonds valued at 5,000 each. And this provided an interest-free loan to support the development project, development of the grounds, the club. The bondholders are guaranteed repayment over a 10-year period. And then it really appealed to individuals who wish to make a significant financial contribution to the club's growth, while also securing, a tangible return on their investment. So by purchasing a bond, they not only assisted the club in funding the development, but it became really integral then shareholders in the club's future success. So we need to see how all that plays out. But I would wager in terms of that 5,000 after the 10-year period, that I would imagine in a lot of cases, the individuals won't request the repayment of the bond afterwards. So it's just a very interesting idea on top of an existing membership scheme. And as a by the way, in terms of how they're going to repay that, Bishopstown GEA, it has a very active membership. It has a club bar and so on. So it has a very strong earned income model. So they would generate profits from that then that would, after the 10-year period, be expected then to go towards the repayment of the bonds. And then just moving through these, just some examples again, Railway Union Rugby Football Club up in Dublin, and it's very much an emphasis on a community model of fundraising. You might be familiar with the club, but faced with decline, the club undertook initiatives such as the school's Rugby Sevens tournament, Ladies' Day, a tag competition, and Legends Night. And all those community-based methods then stabilize the club's finances and then position them then for future success. And there's some detail then in terms of those events. So it was a very concerted effort to look at doing community-based fundraising methods in order to, I suppose, stabilize the club, not just financially, but also then on a community level as well. Moving up then to the Northwest, and again, just in the spirit of just throwing ideas. Sligo Rugby in the Northwest. And again, it's a fundraising strategy very much through community engagement towards financial sustainability. And they looked at things like teenage discos, tag rugby Thursdays. I actually played tag rugby myself up there. I lived up there a good few years ago. A naked calendar initiative. I don't know, is that for everybody? But a bit avant-garde, but it's certainly innovative anyway. And this idea of a take me out evening as well, organized by the ladies team and achieved success through strategic sponsorships, social media driven ticket sales, and an after event party as well. So a significant source of income, and again, elevating the club's brand and reputation. And moving on from that then, a hockey example from England, Hockey Fest. So it's an annual event supported by England Hockey since 2015. And that's seen over 1,000 gatherings across 500 clubs nationwide, uniting players of all ages and abilities in a friendly summer type celebration day. And then individual clubs can customize the event then from mini tournaments to social activities like barbecues. So this is something that you as an individual club then could just take lessons from and run your own individual event. And then with equal participation between genders and generations. So it really embodied, I suppose, the inclusive and community-driven essence of the sport. And something like this has the potential to be an effective fundraiser for individual clubs, opportunities to generate funds while fostering community engagement and promoting your sport. And then an example, and again, I'm just throwing ideas out there, and we can discuss these in the round later on. Gloucester Cricket Club, who employ a variety of creative and engaging fundraising activities through the year, and these include things like guest speaker lunches. So that idea of organizing the lunches with particular guest speakers from, various sources, not just sport, but could be interesting speakers from, politics, economics, etc., business. The idea of Christmas tree sales, cider tasting, so it's a festive season type event. Champagne breakfast, if you're so inclined. Sophisticated and social start to the day. And these backup player competitions, allowing fans to actively support their favorite players. And again, all this is around this consistent messaging around fostering a sense of involvement and camaraderie while also contributing to the club's financial success. So it's trying to create these kind of win-win scenarios. And then coming to the end of this now, but then more locally, the Botanic Hockey Club. And they organise a monthly car boot sale at St. Mary's Holy Faith School in Glasnevin. So great fundraising initiative for them. And the sales are typically managed by volunteers again, so that team reoccurs. Goes on the afternoon. And again, depending on the level of participation and engagement and so on, can be a very interesting source of funding for an organization, but also a great bit of fun and a great bit of community engagement as well. And then just to finish, you'd see them up and down the country now at this stage. But in terms of selling, things like the Window House in Clarny with Kerry GA. And really, I suppose it depends on club connections and so on about how suitable these are in terms of fundraising for a club. Okay, so moving on from that, and I'm trying to squeeze an awful lot into the time allocated. But just what I wanted to mention, and I think Emmy did mention that you will be looking at another further dedicated presentation on grants and so on, but just very quickly, just to bring it into your consciousness again, to talk very briefly, just a couple of slides on the grant side of stuff. That fundraising in itself does have a role with grants, and that's in the form of match funding. So depending on, be it sports capital or be it LSSIF, there will in some cases be match funding required, and that it's based on the deprivation index and so on. So it's not an area I cover myself. It's Patricia Keenan, heads up our grants practice, specialist in it. But for example, I'm working with Trish with the Basketball Ireland, a new arena, and that'll be a combination of grant funding through LSSIF, and then the balance will be made up then through a combination of fundraising and some reserves as well from the organisation. So that's where the two work hand in hand. So in your case, it may not be a dedicated fundraising effort. It could be grants that's subsidised, I suppose the balance subsidised then by fundraising for match funding. But the logic is very much the same, in terms of grant applications and so on. What the grants team are constantly emphasising is everything I've mentioned before in terms of the need to really double down in terms of impact. That's what the assessors want to hear. Community impact, impact in the local community and that whole side of it. And and all these same fundamental questions need to be answered. What do you want to do? How much is it going to cost? Who's going to drive it? How is it going to be project managed? When will it be done? When is the development to take place? And as a part of that whole grants process, the kind of questions that you will be asked, expect to answer is, what is the financial position of your club? Is match funding available? Do you have sources of additional support? What club fundraising activities are going to happen, to get that balance of monies? And coming out of that grants process, the desirable outcomes are that you would have a funding plan in place and you'd have the match funding in place too. be it through reserves, loans, sponsorship, or donations. Okay, and then just before we open up into discussion, so I'm very keen to hear those present in terms of your thoughts, its relevancy to your club, and so on. Again, in a nutshell, it's very easy, I suppose, to spend, be talking now for 40 minutes about methods of fundraising. I really wanted to emphasize today that in terms of a strategy, it's very important to know, like, what's the vision of your club? What's the ambition? What do you want to achieve over the next 5, 10, 20 years? Do you have a plan? Do you have to realize that? Can you cost it? Which is a great question. Like, do you know how much money you need if you're going on fundraising? Do you have an idea how you will raise the money? And who are the people that will support your vision? Will it be individuals? Will it be, one person writing one big check? Will it be 1,000 people giving small amounts? And then how do you communicate your vision? Is it social media? Is it on the ground? Is it print? Etc. etc. So that, in a nutshell, is fundraising for clubs. So